Hello, and welcome back to the Comic Books Matter podcast. I'm your host, Jesse, and with me today is a fellow lover of comics, but also a comics academic in some ways, and the creator of the webcomic, ROSANA. It's Jessica Ginting. And I forgot to ask before if I pronounced your last name right, because I always try to remember to ask that.
That is correct, actually. So yes, Harji Ginting.
Cool. Every once in a while, I'm like, okay, I am very white, so sometimes my brain wants to read it one way where it's 100% not that way.
Oh, it's fine. Uh,
How are you today though? I know it's later in the day for you than it is for me. It's very early in the day for me.
yeah. So hello. I'm doing well today. It's 4:30 p.m. where I am. So I'm based in the UK, and yeah, today's been a busy day because I actually just launched the new pages of Rosanna, the comic that you've mentioned in the intro. So it's been a lot of promotions, a lot of posting on social media, and yeah, a lot of excitement all around.
I love that when we talked about this, I was like, yeah, I can't. I'm gonna try to read as much as your comic as before because I thought it was like an act three. I'm like, oh man, act three, that's a lot of stuff. And you're like, don't worry about it, it's very short. And I'm like, "Ah, it can't be that short." And then I went to go read it yesterday while I was at work, and I was like, did I finish this already?
You have.
um,
What did you think of
but
it?
even though it's a very short book, it's a very dense story, and you get a lot done in like 10 pages, which is very surprising for some of the other web comics I've read where it takes them like 20 chapters to get the ball rolling.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like well, this is something that we just spoke about right before this call, the process of writing comics, and it takes a long time to think about how to structure your pages
Yeah.
because you want to be as efficient as possible. And I think also because of the collaborative nature of it. So I work with a group of either three or two artists. We started Act One with Baji, Osa, and Chong. And I think when we started this comic, uh, none of us really had experience in writing a long form comic in this way. So it was a lot of planning. I spent a lot of time researching, writing, and I'm a very slow writer to begin with. So
Hmm.
I feel like just the length of time spent on every section and every page kind of helps condense everything and make sure we get everything we want in, yeah, just the most efficient way possible so we're not wasting time.
No, and I totally understand. There's a feeling of wasting a page, I think, in comics more so now than any time before, where if you read a lot of like golden age and silver age books, every once in a while there just might be just a random panel that they threw in that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or just dialogue that overstates its welcome. Where now comics are brisk and they have to, even like, if you take the normal published comics, but even web comics, people's attention spans are shorter than normal, or than they used to be, because we have so much vying for our time. So you have to make sure you don't waste their time in any space. I know there's some older comic fans that get grumpy when there's less dialogue in a book and it's all like the art. But
Yeah.
if you read a web comic, that's what you're reading it for mostly. Like if you ever read on like Webtoon, you're scrolling through that because you're keeping up with the action of the art. And I think there's some comics, some Western modern comics that understand that and try to do it too.
No, definitely. I get that sense of wasting a page, the type that you mentioned. And I think when I was making Rosanna as well, just the way our release dates are organized, so we usually released one or two pages every few weeks, every few months even. It's not a very like fast moving process. So I think in that way, whenever we do release a page or two, we wanted to actually give our readers something new to look at and just a new piece of information on every page, which is interesting. I feel like I haven't seen a web comic released in like as slow as slow speed as we do, but I try to do it well. I hope. Oh.
Yeah, and I think keeping that in mind though, like you know that your process is slower, so like the pages that come out have to matter to the people who are reading. I think is very important. I talked about this. I talked about this comic in episode they're like 10 episodes ago. So, but Lore Olympus, right? Like they had a season break, and so there was months without the comic, but she made sure to leave you in an area that was satisfying, that you don't mind waiting. And I think that reading the end of Act 3 that you had left off yesterday that I was reading was in a place where I'm like, okay, I am satisfied here. I can wait for the next part.
Hmm.
And I think that's a smart way to think about when you're writing something that comes out at certain points. Like you would have to know where you end it. I can't remember where I was talking about this. I was talking about anime with a friend though, and we were talking about how anime ends sometimes, and if it should end on a cliffhanger or if it should end in a satisfying way, just in case it doesn't get another season. And my stance was you have to be satisfying enough that people can just leave it, but
Hmm.
also have something open so you can come back to it. And I feel like that's the way you have to end things at all times, because we don't know if we'll ever get another shot at something.
Oh no, that's so true, especially when you bring up stuff like anime or TV shows. I've had so many TV shows where I've been disappointed by the ending, and then I come to find out that they had been like canceled last minute or something. So you know that they had to like scramble to rewrite
Yeah.
the ending, or if they had planned a cliffhanger and just kind of left the audiences there. And that does haunt me every day, every time I think of a show that has been a victim to this kind of thing. But I think in terms of Rosanna and in the comic, uh, what you mentioned about, oh, where was I going with this? Oh, yes, ending things on a cliffhanger. I think this is something that I started thinking about more consciously, especially because we have a rotating art team.
Mm-hmm.
So we have Baji, Osa, and Chong doing Act 1, 2, and right now the current one that's coming out 4. And in between, we have Trench and Nugra. And so they came in and they're doing like a completely different arc. So there are 2 simultaneous stories running. So there's Rosanna on her island, discovering more about her powers. We get a little bit more of her origin. And we have like the International Space Organization chapters, which focuses on a different setting, but it will tie into her story at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think when I'm working with multiple art teams, and people have different time commitments, and it really depends on them how long they want to be working on the project for. So I think I've been consciously trying to write the comic in a way that would have all of their arcs completed, even if they wouldn't continue on this comic like indefinitely or something.
Yeah.
So it's just giving each art team a story arc that they can complete, which, yeah, I think this is something that I've been thinking about more.
And I want to talk more about Rosanna later on, but I want to kind of go back to you as a writer and you as writing in comics, because you sent me an essay to kind of research more about you, that you wrote your master's research on indie comics.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming that that in school wasn't where you discovered comics, that you had liked comics for a long time. So I'm curious, where did the start of you finding comic books and just comics in general and like the love for them come from?
Mm-hmm. So I actually I fell in love with comics in the same way a lot of people did, was through Batman. So I was a big fan of the Nolan films when I was in school, and I hadn't really thought of picking up a comic at that point. But I think my dad was the first person to actually come home and bring back like a Batman or Superman comic. Um, and I started reading it, and I was like, "Whoa, there's so much more story here," because I think that's the reaction you get when you're familiar with like the films, but you never really thought to delve into the comics.
Yeah.
And I started reading more, love DC, love Marvel, and in my bachelor's degree, so in my undergrad, I wrote my dissertation on Watchmen. So that was more of like a literary analysis on the characters and everything.
Hmm.
But that was also happening at the same time when I was discovering a lot of indie comics online, on the internet, the community. And especially when I was making Rosanna, the type of people that I found in the community mostly came from like Twitter. And these people are like making comics on Webtoons, on Tapas. They're even publishing it just as like 1-2 page shorts on Twitter. I've had a lot of memorable comics that I've seen that have just come up as like, yeah, single page comics that people have posted on Twitter. So I was really interested in this whole other sphere of the comic book world. And when I was doing my master's simultaneously, I had also been going to Comic Cons regularly in London, because previously I came from Indonesia. I grew up in Jakarta, and we didn't really have that much of a comic book convention culture as you would find like in the US, I guess,
Hmm.
in the UK as well. So I started getting really interested about it, and you know how people go to cons to for like very different reasons. I think
Yeah.
there's like the gaming section, there's like the cosplay section, there's like the big film and TV show section, and then there's like the actual comic book section.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that I've been hearing by creators on Twitter and online, especially, just basically saying that conventions haven't been pushing the comics as much as it should because they've been focusing on like the big celebrities and the TV panels and everything. Um, so I think that's kind of what drove me to really look into that world a little bit more, and I found a lot of indie comics that I love really.
Yeah, and I think that I think that's something that's super fascinating too about cons in general recently is like how the shift from movies and stuff is now left cons in a weird place because movies and TV shows have their own conventions that they're starting to make, and now the Comic Cons are like, what do we do? Like, I'm curious what San Diego is going to look like after this year because Marvel has their own, like Marvel Disney in general has their own convention, and Warner Brothers doesn't have to go now because they did the fandom or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Last was it the one online on
Yeah,
last? Yeah.
and both of those seem to go off really well.
Mm-hmm.
So, do they have to go back to San Diego? And so it's very curious, like, where, like, do the cons refocus after this and focus more on the books themselves? I'm always appreciative of the ones that are very artist and writer focused, like C2E2 and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
because you can tell that the people coming there are just pure fans of the comics and not people coming to like see what the next big thing is and kind of weirdly uh, I realize I'm about to sound super gatekeeping, which I'm not trying to do, but it's like kind of just go coming for the flash and stuff of
Yeah.
like the spectacle and less about seeing the creators and getting to know the creators and like showing the appreciation. Cause I feel like more so than ever, creators are kind of being pushed to the sidelines when the big movies and stuff come out. Um, I was super excited to see that in the new Suicide Squad trailer that Ostrander's in the trailer. Like he's in the movie and he has like I think co-writing credits on the movie itself. It's like,
Oh, I
see,
didn't know he was a
that's
writer.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that is really cool. And yeah, I think similar to what you said, I have seen more of like this the mainstream superhero cons start popping up in the UK as well. We have this thing called like Heroes and Villains. I think you guys might have it too in the US. I think that's mostly like a DC superhero con, which
Oh,
is
cool.
strange because I'm like, why are you also coming to like the main London Comic Con if you're having your own thing, barely a
Yeah.
month apart? But yeah, is so it's the same then over there, you say, in terms of like the
Yeah, it's
creators.
people just like splintering off more and more. So it makes me wonder what the big cons are going to have to fall back on eventually.
Hmm.
When it comes to indie books, and I know you say you fell in love with more and more indie books. Is there any indie title in particular that like you hold close and dear to yourself?
Um, ooh, well, I think the one off the top of my head that I've been going back to recently is Zorika's Where No One Goes series.
Hmm.
So it's a very like introspective book about basically figuring out yourself and your personal relationships, and it's like a trilogy. So I picked up one of her books at London Comic Con a few years ago, and I just absolutely fell in love with it and the art. And recently I saw her do a Kickstarter for the third one. And I think it's like one of those comic books that really delve into like mental health and like your relationships with your friends and your the people you love. And I think her art is just gorgeous and really evocative in a way that it's like one of those comics that doesn't have a lot of dialogue, because I
Hmm.
think you were mentioning this earlier. There's like yeah, people read comics, people have different preferences when it comes to comics, and especially coming from a prose writer uh, background. So I write prose and I also write poetry, actually. That would be my main thing. I think the transition into comics has been me learning like to know when to hold back on the actual words and
Mhm.
let the visuals do the speaking. So when I first read Zorika's comics, I think this was the thing that I really learned a lot from, just the visual language and how that works. So that's also so that's been a big influence on, yeah, just how I approach art in general. And also Sarah Gordon's Vicious Creatures series. So it's like a series of short comics. It's horror comics, but featuring different animals. Um,
Okay.
and it's kind of like metaphorical in a way, and it's set in like different time periods. There's one in like Victorian London, and there's one about like a struggling artist going mad. And I think the animal featured there is like a barn owl that she keeps seeing. Um, and I think this is another one that I picked up at a convention, and I've just been following her work since. So yeah, I think those are the ones that I've been thinking about recently.
To go talk about your poetry for a second, I think it's something that people don't think about as often. I think
Mhm.
poetry works really well for comics.
Mm.
Because I think the narrative sense of pictures helps propel poetry more so than every time I have the word and it disappears.
That happens.
uh narrative sense, right? Like poetry is very non-narrative in a lot of ways. You can have very narrative poetry that paints a certain picture and draws you to a certain end goal. But a lot of poetry, at least a lot of poetry I write, is very um, kind of more feeling than anything else. And I think adding art to that and adding consecutive art to that can really amplify the feeling and the emotion that goes into poetry. So I think I don't think people do it as often, but I think if people really focus in on poetry and comics, I think that could be a whole new genre that could explode because I think it would work really well.
Yeah, I would be so into that. Yeah, I think what you said was totally true about just the visual element of poetry, and how you have to really express the feeling instead of like using a bunch of words to describe something at length. And I feel like poetry is also about like constricting the amount of words you put on a page.
Mhm.
You want to make it as concise as possible, which is also a similar thing that you're doing in comics, because you don't want it to run on for too long. And yeah, you're trying to be as economical as you can with these spaces. And yeah, I feel like I would like to explore this more, actually. I don't know. I haven't really seen any explicit poetry comics. Um, yeah, I don't know if you know of any like sequential
Um,
type.
I know of some writers who have experimented with forms like that. I think like Becky Cloonan in the way she would write her independent books. Because I just read one recently for another episode. It's very sparse and it feels very poetic the way she's writing the book and making it kind of like an old tale. And I think there's other comics like I think Tom King can experiment sometimes with this, and I think he did that kind of in some of his Batman work, which people probably didn't like those issues, but experimented with talking very limitedly in a poetic sense to the art. I don't think anybody's explicitly done poetry to art like that I know of off the top of my head. But
Mhm.
I think the best way to compare it is makes me think of old Looney Tunes cartoons and how they would use just classical music. There would be no dialogue. They would just use the classical score and then animate to the score. And the score is not telling you a story, but they're using the score to emphasize the story they wanted to tell you. And I feel
Oh,
like poetry can do the same thing to comics.
yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I'm just thinking about this a lot now, and I'm going to look it up right after this call to look for more.
And so I know that you wrote your master's research on indie comics and then you made Rosanna. And the thing I'm super curious about is what you think about people who kind of read webcomics and go, well, you're just ripping off this, or you're just taking the stuff from this. Because I think the idea of a homage to to a lot of people is dead, which is weird.
Yes.
Because you read Rosanna in that first arc, you're like, well, this is very Wonder Woman esque, like this
Mm.
person showing up into this foreign area, and she comes and takes them down, kind of feeling very much like Steve Trevor crashing onto them and scare and stuff. But then you read further, and it keeps on changing, kind of like how you feel throughout. And I
Mhm.
think homage, but even inspiration from other mediums, is something that people should embrace more. Not disregarding like where those original stories come from, because I know people super whitewash things or super take things out of context. Like there's a whole blow up about like how everybody compares every Asian based story now to Avatar, which was created by two white guys. Like,
Oh, I saw
like
that on Twitter last night.
yeah, like that's a big, huge discussion. I think there's 100% of a valid argument to talk about homage taking too far, and people kind of going nuts on anybody that's actually talking about the authentic thing. Um, but I also think there's a sense of homage and inspiration that um, we should embrace, because it inspires further growth of that kind of story. That's why I love like new takes on like old mythos, like Olympus and stuff like that, because it breathes fresh life into something that's so old.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's really interesting what you said about the Wonder Woman similarities, because I've been writing this since like 2018 now, and I did not once think about that. So that's really interesting. And now like
Yeah.
I totally see it when you say it. um, and I think it's really funny because I think most one of the earliest kind of inspirations, and I guess like yeah, the kind of things that I wanted to pay homage to was the whole Marvel universe and that idea of, you know, in Infinity War, the arc when, you know, a bunch of people left Earth
Yeah.
and the flip happened. That's what they call it now. And so Rosanna has kind of like that similar thing, wherein a lot of the, I think it's a quarter, I have to get my numbers right, a quarter of the Earth's population had gone off to the stars to seek new life. And after, I think, 2 decades or so, people had been living in isolation, and Rosanna has been really insulated in her community.
Mhm.
And she's had a good life. You know, I feel like her community is one of the ones that had benefited from this whole insular life because they've been sustaining and all of that. But I think a major part of the story going forward is going to be her leaving her island and seeing that that's not the case for everyone as well.
Mhm.
Um, and I think I was also inspired during the time when I was conceptualizing this a little bit by Black Panther as well, in the way that they fuse their like traditional African elements with sci-fi. I kind of wanted to do that for something Indonesian as well, because I think sci-fi is not as popular in Indonesia as other genres. I think we've had a superhero resurgence recently in the past 5 years or so. Um, but a lot of our superheroes are more like mythological based, and I
Yeah.
think we're a lot more into fantasy, and I think that's a cultural thing as well. Um, People are a lot more into fantasy than sci-fi, so I thought that it was a good opportunity to kind of like test the waters and see what it would look like in an Indonesian setting.
And that's honestly super awesome here, because I think that's like the one of the most positive things the MCU has done
Mhm.
overall, is to make superheroes more accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm hearing more and more of other countries and stuff having a kind of like a comic book resurgence of like, wait a second, we can make these.
Yeah.
And not relying on Western books to kind of guide the hand anymore. It's something that I like seeing, that anime and manga has taken over a bit more in the US and stuff. It's like, yes, there are other ways to make comic books, and we really should be seeing this. Um, that was like the coolest thing about Futures End, is they kind of embrace the giant anthology format, and it's exciting.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, I haven't really looked into what a lot of other countries are doing in terms of their like mainstream comic book resurgences. But in Indonesia, it definitely is really interesting to watch as well, because we've kind of started our whole cinematic universe of superheroes as well. I think the first film dropped right before the pandemic, actually. So we had like a whole release lined up with all of our superheroes, and these are superheroes that have been they've been here since like I think basically the 60s or even longer than that. But I don't think it was like cool until recently. And now they're
Yeah.
going to the big screen, which is really exciting. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of them once the pandemic kind of ends, which seems difficult to picture right now, but yeah, that's one of the things I'm looking forward to.
And I think that's why it's key. Like, we don't hold people back by saying, you shouldn't be writing this because it's too much like this one thing. It's like, if you stranglehold the original to make it the end all be all, you really suffocate the rest of the artistic like world to not be as creative, because you need that inspiration to build off of.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I think especially when it comes to people of color just kind of deciding what stories they want to tell, I think, well, first things first, there's always like an added pressure as like a person of color, like
Yeah.
entering like a white dominated space when you're just like, I need to get this so right just for like my entire people, which is like too much burden for, I feel like, one creator or any group of creators to handle on their own. I feel like people should be focusing on telling their stories as best they can. Um, but so I feel like, yeah, people of color are already critical enough of the stories that they're telling. And having like that extra form of like gatekeeping, being like, oh, we'll only accept like a certain type of story from you, is,
Yeah.
I feel like it's not good for the creative landscape.
And there's always those people that go, well, of course you made this. It's just like this character. And it's frustrating because then the people then turn around then, and we have like, gosh, I cannot remember who the character's name is, but the new Batman, who's black, and he's a really cool character. And people are like, why did you have to change Batman's skin color? It's like, dude, what do you want? Do you want us to make something like Batman, or make Batman something that's like us, so we can like talk about these stories?
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of the frustrating inroads right now. But I think the more it's explored, especially in indie books, but I want like the big two to kind of embrace those inroads more. It becomes the new normal, and that's what's important.
No, definitely. Yeah. And I feel like I have been seeing the big two branching out a little bit more in terms of, who they're hiring to kind of
Yeah.
tell new stories, and giving creators a little bit more creative license when it comes to these like maybe alternate universe versions of these characters. I'm not sure if we've had any like major changes to the canon, but I have seen like stories popping up here and there. I mean, there was that whole thing, Gotham High, last year,
Yeah.
where it featured like an Asian Bruce Wayne in like a high school setting. And I know the story was kind of just like a fun YA type recreation of Batman. But I feel like that got people really angry to begin with.
Yeah, it's
And
really frustrating to see, like, hey guys, this, like, this is a canon. Like, why are you upset about even just this?
yeah, exactly.
Well, there was another one of those YA books. Oh, it's that Starfire one that's coming out. The Daughter of Starfire, and it's like a small white goth girl, and everybody's like, why why is Starfire's daughter goth? I'm like, dude, this book isn't for you, you 35-year-old man in your like man cave. Like, this isn't the one you're gonna want to read anyways. Why are you complaining about it?
No, exactly. Especially with the amount of choice out there. It's just like, obviously, these publishers are going to want to reach as wide as an audience as they can. And not everything is going to be for you. I feel like this is the thing that frustrates me a lot, especially when you're considering like the publishing side of things. You're like, of course, if you want to be cynical about it, it's just like they want to make money too by
Yeah.
selling their comics to a wider net of people. But yeah, I don't know what these
and
people
it
want.
and if the oldest older generation isn't going to make room for kids in the modern era, which you like, at this point, I think there's no going back to making mainstream comics straight for kids anymore, because the storylines are just too dark. They're just,
Yeah.
and they're too complex. Like, there's a lot going on. You pick up any Marvel book, and there's about 60 books you should have read before it. And same thing with DC now. That these YA stories have to exist to bridge that gap now.
Mhm.
They have to get kids familiar with the characters to get them any hope into getting them into the mainstream comics.
No, absolutely. I don't think I can think of like a single yeah, canon story that I would recommend to like a child to pick up and just
Yeah.
without no background context. Um, Maybe some of the older ones, but
Yeah,
yeah,
you have to go back to like the golden and silver age to get anywhere near
yeah,
something that like I would be happy to give my 10-year-old nephew.
yeah. Um,
To kind of move on to some question and answers, that I have a few questions for you.
Cool.
I have one listener write in asking, Eddie asks, that you write wonderful non-graphic comic book stories, or non-graphic or non-comic book stories in literature as well. And like you say you write poetry and fiction. How do you choose which medium you want to express what story in?
Oh, that's a really interesting one. I feel like, hmm, I feel like more and more I've been having to think about this more because for the past few years, Rosanna has been basically the only comic that I've worked on. But I've made it a goal of mine this year to try to write more non Rosanna comics as well.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever a story does come into my head, I think to myself, do I want this to be a comic? Or do I want to turn this into a short story? And I feel like the answer so far has been down to the length of that story. If it's something that I think I have a fully baked idea and I know it can be a set number of pages and I can visualize it as a comic, um, that's probably what I'm going to go for. Whereas if it's like a very long and like epic story with lots of characters and world building, uh, I would probably go for like a long form, yeah, prose thing. Whereas poetry, I try to write poems like maybe a few a week, so that's something that I'm always just practicing anyway. But there have been instances of me kind of writing a poem and being like, oh, should this be a story instead? Because I love just inserting sci-fi into all of my mediums, including
Mm-hmm.
poetry. There's this collection that I've been writing for, I think, the past 3 years or so. So I published my first collection in 2017. And since then, I've been trying to put together my next one. And my first theme was for the collection was like a theme based on, so sorry, the concept is 5 people on a spaceship, and the poems would be written from all their perspectives, and it would kind of like intertwine like a story would. But then that got too complicated, so I kind of left that there.
I know
And
that
I
feeling.
yeah, but it was a good concept, I feel, to kind of to start off with. And now I've been writing more just general poems about the future, about like speculative fiction and ideas and that kind of thing. And I feel like that's been a lot more helpful. But I did like that concept that I started out with, but I don't think it would be published anywhere.
And you kind of answer this, but I'll still ask the following question from Eddie: Is do comic books appeal to you for certain types of stories, or is it more of what you feel like at the time, when you decide to use comic books instead of just straight narrative? It made it sound like you basically check out the length, and if the length is short enough, that's when you feel like it should be a comic book.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, sorry, my voice is suddenly gone. Um, so I think even with Rosanna, I wasn't really thinking about the length at first, which I probably should have, um, because this is the advice that people mention, um, of, oh, sorry, I don't know why my voice is suddenly gone.
Oh, it's okay.
I might need a drink of water for a second.
Yeah, no problem. Take your time.
Okay, I feel like I'm back now. uh, so yeah, so with Rosanna, I actually wasn't thinking about the length at first. Um, and that's where I kind of started to think about ways I could make sure that the story has certain arcs where people could dip in and out if they wanted to, and that it would make sense for someone who's not following the whole thing, even though it's not that long to begin with. But I think another thing that I consider is just the visual element in general. So yeah, I just think about how it looked like on a page, on the panels, and if I can really picture it in my mind, then that's probably when it's going to be a comic.
And last question is, when navigating the webcomic space, especially since you did so much research on it and now you're writing comics in the space, what some advice you can give to early adapters to webcomics, people who want to explore webcomics instead of trying to publish with one of the big publishers?
Mhm. So I think my advice would be to read as many as you can. So read, just a different range of them, really. I think what I mentioned earlier about those short 1-2 pages of comics on Twitter really helped me get a sense of, what people can achieve in such a short space. Because I think if you're only reading those gigantic, like 500-page webcomic epics as well,
Yeah.
that's like very hard to plan around. And you might, lose steam or burn out before you get to even the beginning of that. Um, and I would say also learn and try to find as many resources as you can from creators. And because that's what I did a lot when I was doing my first dissertation on Watchmen. When I was still just learning about the comic form in general, I was reading just a lot of books about how to make them, what's important to look out for. Scott McCloud's, I think, is probably like a staple for a lot of comics makers. And Linda Berry's as well. Is that her name? Yes, it's Linda Berry's Making Comics. So yeah, I think just kind of experiment, but also be open to learn.
Jessica, thank you again for coming on, especially since we planned this so quickly. It was exciting to kind of like explore your work and get hyped for the show. Where can people find you in particular, but then also find the comic Rosanna and anything else you want to plug right now?
Oh, cool. Yeah, so people can find me on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is at jginting, so JGINTING. And I have a link to my website, jessicaginting.com, where I post a lot of my work, comics and non-comics related work as well. Rosanna we're updating the pages on our website, rosanacomic.com, and you'll find the Twitter handles on Instagram, the handles on Instagram and Twitter at Rosanna Comic. And also, I actually have a YouTube channel where I talk about comics sometimes. So yeah, that's probably going to be on my Twitter as well. I put all my links there. So yeah.
Cool. And you can find this show on Twitter at Comics Matter Pod, Facebook at facebook.com/comicsmatter. You can email me and the show. I am the show, I guess, at comicbooksmatter@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest on the show, have a question for future guests, or have a story that you want read on the show, you can reach me at all those places. Please leave a review and tell a friend if you feel obligated to. And also, I don't promote this enough, but I do put these episodes on YouTube if you want to listen to them that way. The logo for the show is done by my friend Steven, and the theme was Join the Restaurant by David Szesztay. And lastly, everybody, remember, as always, Captain America also punched Nazis.